What does it mean to play in a world designed by colonizers? Today, I want us to think about what it means when our games, our stories, and the heroes and monsters within them are shaped by colonial thought. In this context, play can be defined as to engage in activity for enjoyment and recreation rather than a serious or practical purpose. A game can be defined as a form of play or sport, especially a competitive one played according to rules and decided by skill, strength, or luck. Based on those definitions, games and play come across as harmless, apolitical, and not that deep. But Trammell, in Decolonizing Play, argues that we shouldn't assume all gameplay is inconsequential just because it's a game. Trammell reminds us that play, especially in the Western context, has always been embodied with values, many of which are tied to concepts of conquest, individualism, and control. In referencing writer and narrative designer Meghna Jayanth, Trammell expresses the connection between white European thought and games. He writes, "Simply put, the deeply connected histories of games and colonialism have produced a context where the pleasures of many games are colonial pleasures. They assume that the player and the player's agenda are so exceptional that all acts of violence, coercion, theft, and subjugation will eventually be forgiven, if not rewarded. Thus, games train players to learn an empathy for the ideology of colonialism. Through play, players are rewarded with pleasures when they subjugate others, exploit the resources around them, and, to cite Jayanth again, remake the world as self-expression." One specific example of how colonial thought has manifested itself in games is explored in the Ludic Bestiary by Sarah Stang and Aaron Trammell. In the text, the authors explore how the hag, a female-coded monster in Dungeons & Dragons, is typically portrayed. Even though she's immortal, she's portrayed as old and haggard. She is innately evil, despises goodness, and wields powerful magic. She often uses that magic to change her appearance, usually to deceive others. She can self-reproduce, creating beings that are identical to her. And the authors point out that hags don't like each other, but they still form covens, exchange gifts, and share knowledge. The authors explain that hags are positioned as a threat to the player, and that this positioning is directly connected to patriarchal structures and misogyny. If monsters reflect what a society fears, as the authors explain, then hags must represent a specific kind of fear. In a patriarchal society, she becomes a figure of unease, an older woman living outside the roles she's expected to play, not in service of men or the traditional Western family structure. Wrapped up in this is the fear of women aging, being independent, sharing knowledge with each other, and standing in solidarity with one another. Now, I'm not trying to cancel Dungeons & Dragons. It's just one example of how larger oppressive structures can make their way into games and how we play. Since D&D's emergence in the 1970s, it's shaped the visuals, language, and mechanics of fantasy games, both directly and indirectly. So when a new game builds upon what came before, without challenging the foundation steeped in patriarchy and colonial thought, we end up reinforcing the same oppressive systems. When these patterns go unchallenged, when they're treated as the default rules of fantasy play, that's how oppressive power structures get reinforced in subtle ways. Subtle because we're told to see play as harmless. But if the stories we engage with are quietly reflecting systems of oppression, we're still absorbing those messages. I talk about all this not because I'm a raging feminist looking for something to be mad about. I talk about it because I love this stuff. These things are integral to my development as a researcher, an artist, a social justice advocate. The Elder Scrolls shaped how I think about writing and the agency that comes with imagination. God of War, that series is foundational to my love for storytelling. Before that, Wizard 101 was one of my first online games where I could run around and cast spells as a character who looked like me. And before that, my dad had me watching him play Diablo on our gateway computer. And it's because of this love for fantasy and games and play that I want to see them decolonized. If fantasy and play are about building any world you want, with characters who can do anything you imagine and the freedom to engage however you choose, then there's no room for colonial thought in that space. I know there's nuance. I know there's all kinds of histories and intersections and structures and individuals that we could discuss. But for now, let's just sit with this. As writers, artists, researchers, designers, daydreamers, dungeon masters, how can we decolonize play? Well, in discussing the academic study of play, Trammell writes, "Perhaps the most profound way any of us can resist the colonial tropes embedded in play theory is to read, learn, and understand what the legacy of colonialism means for those who have lived through it and their descendants. This modest act helps to reveal all of the small and subtle ways that theories of play are indebted to a strain of white European thought that belittles, stereotypes, and denigrates Black, brown, and indigenous knowledge. I also think we can ask ourselves, what happens when we reclaim play? When we question the stories we've inherited and imagine new ones? What happens when we write our own monster manuals? How can the pursuit of decolonizing play and games, genre and character, be a part of the larger pursuit for liberation and resistance? To end with a quote from the Ludic Bestiary, and to use it as an example, the authors identify colonial violence in games as a convention that can be challenged. They write, "Once we recognize it as a convention, we can choose to do something different. Instead of remediating a vision of monstrosity which is embedded in patriarchal mythology, misogynistic ideology, and cliched popular tradition, game designers could instead re-envision monstrosity. Could the Ludic Bestiary become an instrument of inclusivity? Could we imagine monstrosity that celebrates differences instead of marginalizing it? Could we move away from a hypermasculine and xenophobic vision of the human hero and orient ourselves toward a new understanding and appreciation of the post-human, transhuman, non-human, or fully human monster?" My takeaway from all this is that if we take the time to notice what we're engaging with, if we ask where our ideas about monsters and heroes and play come from, then we create room to imagine differently. And when we imagine differently, we loosen the hold that colonial thinking can have on our engagement and creativity. What's left in its place is our own unruly, uncontrollable imagination. And that, I think, is where a lot of power is held. If you sat through this whole thing, thank you so much for watching. This video is kind of a test run for something I'm thinking of doing with my PhD research community in the future. So thank you for being here and letting me experiment with delivering information. Thank you for being patient with the noise of construction outside my window, with the reflection in my glasses. All the sources I referenced and the ones I mentioned the authors referencing are listed in the video description. So thank you again. I really appreciate it, and take care of yourself. Bye.